I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe. We can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, you know, get you out of bed in the morning. And then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist, with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. It's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. You let all that nonsense burn away. And you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is, that's a lie. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Take on the consequences of error and learn from it, and then you win constantly, because even if something goes sideways, you think there's something to be derived from this. When you're in the world and something objects to you, something that matters objects to you, then in the entire unrealized world is in that thing that objects. It's all tangled up inside it. That's why it's the great dragon of chaos. It's everything that's outside of your conceptual structure. And what is that? It's everything that lurks outside of your walled city. And it's manifested itself like the snake in the garden. And the easiest thing to do is say, I'm not having anything to do with that. But the problem with that is, well, you get your C- and you don't do anything about it. Maybe you're a little bitter and more resentful, and your study habits get a little worse. So the next time you get like a D+. And then you collect a bunch of F's, and then you stop going to school, and then you stop showering, right? Then you end up jumping off the bridge. And so that's how the dragon eats you when you don't pay attention to it. And so it's no bloody wonder that people avoid, you know. It's really no wonder that they avoid, because error messages contain within them the implicit world. Now the upside of that is, well, they contain within them the implicit world. And the world isn't all negative, and so maybe you get your C-, and that's actually the best gift you ever got, because somebody finally took you and went, whack, you know, clue in. And so you take that apart and you think, oh, I don't know how to write. I don't know how to think. I've never read anything in my life. My study habits are abysmal, you know, like maybe I'm working at 2% efficiency, which it's like to find that out is so optimistic. I mean, if you're barely hanging in there, but you're only working at 2%, you might imagine what you could have as a life if you're working at like 50%. So the C- can be the best gift you ever had, and that's the gold that the dragon hoards. That's exactly what that means. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. And now it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible, but you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. You are the thing that is, and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's, well, you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, well, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time, but now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people. And that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and you get them doing nice things for other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiation. You know, you're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend some time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that's outside of your, you know, your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally, and so forth. So you can, I think partly what you're doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where, you know, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks than you were before. Life has got its rat's nest of miseries, and that's for sure. And maybe you could even make a categorical statement that life is mostly a rat's nest of misery. You know, and you could make a pretty powerful argument for that. But then there's a counter question, which is, well, what if you tried not to make it any more miserable than it had to be, right? Then what would it be like? I would suspect that most of that misery would go away, because it's the unnecessary misery that really brings you down. You know, it's like, well, if someone has cancer, it's like, that sucks. But it's not like you can say, if only we had done this differently, then that wouldn't have happened. But when someone's out like torturing you in a malevolent way, or maybe you're doing the same, you can always ask yourself, well, is this really necessary? Is this just like a useless add-on to the miseries of life? That's what disheartens people. And so even in your own life, if you aren't suffering from self-imposed misery, and you're only suffering from inescapable misery, maybe you could handle that, and even maybe without becoming irredeemably corrupt. So the goal would be, well, yeah, life is a rat's nest of miseries, and maybe it has no ultimate meaning. We could say that if we're feeling particularly pessimistic, but it still leaves one question open, which is, if you didn't do everything you could to make it worse, how good could you make it be? And the least answer is, well, it could be tragedy, but maybe not hell. Are you depressed, or do you just have a horrible life? And those are not the same question, because if you're depressed, you have a life that in principle should work, but isn't. And so you come and say, look, I've got a lot of things going for me. You know, I've got a good job, I've got a good family, my wife loves me, but man, I'm miserable all the time. It's like, okay, well, let's delve into that a bit more deeply. But that kind of sounds like depression. But then you might come and say, well, I'm miserable, I'm suffering, I don't even want to be alive. And then I might ask, well, do you have an intimate partner? Well, no, not really. And I have had a history of catastrophic relationships. Do you have any friends? Well, you know, I have this one person I phone like once every month or so, but other than that, no, I don't really see anyone. Well, do you have any close family? No, my family's pretty fractured. I don't get along with my mom and dad. I don't see my sisters or my siblings much. It's like, well, how about a job, or how about a career, or failing that, a job? It's like, well, I've always kind of been underemployed, and I just lost my job, and you know, that's not going very well, and so on. You can walk through someone's life, and you can find out if they're reasonably embedded in a hierarchy of social institutions. And if the answer is no, no intimate partner, no family, no children, no friends, no job, no career, no educational pathway, no engagement in civic responsibility, let's say, no church attendance, no spiritual life, no routine. It's like, well, you're not depressed, you just have a horrible life, multidimensionally. Like, it's no wonder you're depressed. There's nothing in your life that is working. But it's interesting, because that's not exactly a diagnosis at the level of the individual. It's a diagnosis in relationship to the relationship between the individual and this structure of containing social institutions. If you don't have an intimate partner, and you don't have a family, and you don't have any friends, and you don't have a career or a job or any civic involvement, or any involvement, let's say, with religious institutions, and you don't have any creative striving, all you've got left is pain. And so that's what you have. And so here's a different way of thinking about sanity. Sanity isn't being well constituted as an atomized individual. Sanity is what makes itself manifest if you're properly situated in a hierarchy of social order. To be well constituted, you have to be a harmonious player in a multidimensional symphony in some real sense of social interaction. It's very hard to stay on the straight and narrow without a partner who doesn't share your blind spots, correcting you constantly. You know, now that's annoying. There's a tussling about it, right? There's a fractious and adversarial element to that, because if you're married, you don't see eye to eye, and thank God for that, because sometimes in your foolish insistence on being right, you're wrong, and wrong in a way that'll take you out. And so you better have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And fortunately, if you have a partner, you have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And so if you can get the dialogue flowing, then that's a mutually corrective mechanism. And so then you might say, well, the truthful dialogue between partners in a marriage is actually, it's the process by which sanity itself is generated. And I mean technically, it's like you're too complex to regulate yourself, period. And so you need other people to help you do that. So if you have a wife or a husband, someone who knows you and is there for the long run, they can help, you can help each other find the meaningful path and stay on it. And you can't do that alone. And probably just having a partner isn't enough. You need kids, likely, to keep you sane or to drive you crazy, depending on the nature of your children. Let's say you need family, you need your parents, you need your siblings, you need another community around you that's not merely your wife, because you're so crazy that it takes a village to keep you sane. And so, and then surrounding that more intimate web of kinship, you need friends. And friends keep you sane. Well, how? Well, you have to act in a manner that makes them want to be around you to have friends. And that means that to maintain your friendships, you have to be saner than you really are, right? You have to be, they have to be able to enjoy their time with you. If you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, Are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that's just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure, regardless of its scope? And the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise, in its deepest sense, is that process of preparation. And you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal.
The Greeks had the maxim, know thyself. How do we come to know ourselves in terms of our personalities and, more importantly, potential? Well, one of the first ways to come to know yourself is to understand that you don't. You can learn to kind of watch yourself like you're watching a stranger. You have to adopt a position. It's a position of radical humility, I would say. Humility in two senses. So one sense would be the humility of recognizing your ignorance. So you have to understand that you don't know who you are. That's not easy to understand, because you think you know, but then you remember you can't control yourself very well. You're not very disciplined. You're full of flaws. Maybe you don't know yourself as well as you think, but it's hard to get low enough to understand how deeply it is the case that you are ignorant about who you are. Now, there's an upside to that too, which also is that you're also ignorant about who you could be. And so the discovery of that, is some reward for the horror of determining who you actually are. And then I would say, well, then you watch yourself. You watch yourself like you're watching a stranger. You watch what you say and you listen. You think, well, what sort of person would say that? And how am I reacting emotionally when I'm communicating in that manner? Is that making me feel stronger or weaker? Is it filling me with shame? Is it helping my confidence? Am I laying out a lie? Am I deceiving myself and other people? Am I adopting this personality at parties that is designed to impress and to amuse, and it comes across as nothing but self-centered narcissism? What are my dark fantasies? What are my aggressive fantasies? What is it that I'm willing to do? What am I interested in so that I'll spontaneously pursue it? What do I procrastinate about and why? What am I unwilling to do? What do I think is good? What do I congratulate myself for accomplishing? And what do I berate myself for failing to confront and to implement? Those are all incredibly complicated questions, and you don't know the answers to them. So that's a start. And then in terms of potential, well, you'll discover a little bit more about your potential as you discover who you are, especially the darker parts of yourself, because then you discover your potential for mayhem. There's some real utility in that. It's actually something that strengthens you, because the first thing that a realization like that can in fact produce is the ambition to incorporate that dangerousness into a higher order personality. And that can make you implacable. That can make you someone who can say no when you need to say no. That can make you someone who won't avoid necessary conflict. And so that's unbelievably useful. And so that's one of the potentials that you might discover. The other thing you do to discover your potential is to, well, you challenge yourself. You know, it's like rule 4 in my book, 12 Rules for Life, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And that's kind of a good way to start this. It's like, well, take a bit of a look at yourself and think about what's not so good that you could improve, that you should improve by your own standards, and that you would improve, you know, and set yourself a little goal. You know, maybe you're not studying at all at your university, or maybe you're at work and you've got this stack of paper there, you know, and you haven't looked at that damn stack for like a month, and you know that you should be, and you're bothering yourself at night because you're avoiding that. You think, well, I've avoided that stack of paper completely for 1 month. I'm quite a coward when it comes to whatever snakes might be hidden in that stack of paper. How about tomorrow I just like put that stack of paper in front of me on my desk and I glance through it for 15 seconds. See if I can do that. It's like, well, you set yourself a goal of improvement. You know, it's a humble goal, because really, are you such a coward that the best that you can bloody well manage after a month of avoidance is 15 seconds of exposure to a stack of paper? You know, it could easily be. You've been avoiding it. You're obviously afraid of it. And so the situation could be that dismal and dire. And you might think, well, geez, it's no balm to my ego. It's not fostering the strength of my ego to recognize in myself someone who could only withstand 15 seconds of exposure to that thing I'm afraid of. And so that's a form of humility too. It's like, there's things you could do to improve, and you know what they are. And there's small steps that you could take, that you might take, that would put you in that direction. And then the question is, are you big enough to take those small steps? You know, are you capable of grappling with the fact that you're fundamentally flawed to the point where you have to break things down into almost childlike steps in order to manage them? And the answer to that is, yeah, you are. And that's the lot of, I don't know if it's the lot of everyone. Most people have things they avoid, you know, and they're afraid of. So I would say to some degree, it's the lot of everyone. People vary in the degree to which they've conquered that. And you do meet people from time to time who are extraordinarily disciplined. But most of the time they've got disciplined in exactly this manner. It's through slow incremental improvement. And then you challenge yourself. It's like, well, could I do this? That would be better. And you find out. And then you think, well, is there something slightly larger and more challenging that I could do that would be better? And you try it and you find out. And as you try it and you find out, generally you get better at it and you can take on larger and larger challenges. You know, you take responsibility for yourself. That's part of standing up straight with your shoulders back. It's like, take on the world, man, but only at the level that you can manage. You know, when you're ignorant and biased and deeply flawed and immature, it's where everyone starts. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew, but it doesn't mean that you can't wrestle with part of reality. You know, some part that's small enough so that you have a good shot at victory. To put yourself together, the first steps towards that is to allow yourself to be a fool, right? It's because you don't know what you're doing. You have to admit that. And there's going to be a loss of ego or destruction of ego, arrogant ego that necessarily accompanies that. But you need the loss of that arrogant ego because it's precisely what's interfering with your movement forward. You know, it's part of the adversarial process, mythologically speaking, that stops moral progress. You're too proud of who you think you are to notice what you're like so that you could change properly. You don't want to sacrifice that part of yourself. It's probably associated with some delusion that helps you maintain a positive, although very fragile self-image, you know, in the absence of genuine effort. It's not to be recommended. You know yourself by watching and paying attention. It's watching like you're a snake. A snake watches like cold-bloodedly with no emotional reaction, just to see what's there. It doesn't allow, symbolically speaking, doesn't allow what is wanted or desired to interfere with what is observed. So you watch yourself like that, as if you don't know who you are. Well, that's the beginning. And then you challenge yourself continually to see how far past yesterday you can push today and tomorrow, and to continually experiment with expanding the domains not only of your competence but of your ability to increase that competence. And the upper limit to that is proportional to the moral effort that you put into it. The more that's guided by the highest of all possible visions, right? The alliance with the highest of all possible conceivable good. And the more it's accompanied by truth in speech and action, the more you will develop your potential. And you also, I suppose, have to be willing to undertake that as an adventure, because it's a hell of a thing to bear that kind of responsibility. It takes a person out of the ordinary. It takes them out of themselves. And there's an alienation and an isolation that goes along with that, and a great sorrow, all of that together. But there's deep meaning to be had in it, and there isn't anything better that you can do. So that's the answer to that question.
You need structure, you need predictability, and you need more of it than you think, just to keep you sane. Now, if you're lucky, and maybe a bit odd, you can deviate 5% from the norm, or 10% from the norm, or something like that, carefully and cautiously, as long as the rest of you is all well ordered in a normative manner. You might be able to get away with that, and you might be able to sustain it across time, and people might be able to tolerate you if you do it. Or maybe you'll get really lucky and you happen to be creative but reasonably well put together, and people will actually be happy that there's something idiosyncratic and unique about you. But even under those circumstances, mostly what you want is to have a routine that's disciplined, that's predictable, and bloody well stick to it. You're going to be way healthier and happier and saner if you do that. And then the other thing that you need, because this is one of the things the psychoanalysts got wrong, I think, is that they overestimated the degree to which sanity was a consequence of being properly structured internally, you know? Because from the psychoanalytic point of view, you're sort of an ego, and that ego is inside you. And of course, it rests on an unconscious structure. But the purpose of psychoanalysis is to sort out that unconscious structure and the ego on top of it, and to make you a fully functioning and autonomous individual. But there's a problem with that, because the reason that you're sane as a fully functional and autonomous human being isn't because you've organized your psyche, even though that's important. The reason that you're sane, if you have a well-organized unconscious and ego, is because other people can tolerate having you around for reasonably extensive periods of time, and will cuff you across the back of the head every time you do something so stupid that people will dislike you permanently if you continue. And so what people are doing to each other all the time, just non-stop, is broadcasting sanity signals back and forth, right? It's like you smile at people if they're not only behaving properly, but behaving in a way that you would like to see them continue to behave. You frown at them if they're not, you ignore them if they're not, you shun them, you roll your eyes at them, you manifest a disgust face, you don't listen to them, you interrupt them, you won't cooperate with them, you won't compete with them. It's like you're blasting signals at other people about how to regulate their behavior so frequently, well, it just makes up all of your social interaction. That's why we face each other, and we have emotional displays on our face, and we're looking at each other's eyes, and we know as much as we can about what's going on with each other, given that we don't have immediate access to the contents of their consciousness. And so partly what you're doing with your routine is establishing yourself as a credible, reliable, trustworthy, potentially interesting human being who isn't going to do anything too erratic at any moment. And everyone else is around there tapping you into shape, making sure that that's exactly what you are. And that's how you stay sane. And so what happens to people too, if they don't have a routine and they get isolated, is they start to drift. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt It isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1,000,000, and 2 persons away from 1,000,000,000. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life, and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century. The internal problem is, how do you deal with tragedy and malevolence? And you can say, well, I'm not prepared. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Unsurprising, especially if you were overprotected as a child. It's not a good idea to overprotect your kids, because the snakes are going to come into the garden no matter what you do. And so then you, instead of trying to keep the damn snakes away, what you do is you arm your child with something that can help them chop them into pieces and make the world out of them. So that the trick for human thriving in the face of suffering and malevolence is strength, not protection. It's a completely different idea. We also know this clinically. We know, for example, that if you treat people with exposure therapy for agoraphobia, which is, roughly speaking, the fear of chaos, I would say, the fear of everything, you don't make them less afraid. You make them braver. It's not the same thing. Because with an agoraphobic, see, what happens to them is the fall. They never conceptualize death and suffering. They're naive. Right? It never enters the theater of their imagination, and it's because they're protected from it. But then something happens. This often happens to women in their 40s, because they're the people most likely to develop agoraphobia. Something happens. They've been protected from chaos by authority their entire life. So maybe they had an overprotective father, and then they went to an overprotective boyfriend, and then they went to an overprotective husband. And maybe they were willing to be subjugated to all three of those because of the protection, right? So that's the bargain. They stay weak and dependent, and maybe they have to because that's the only way they can appeal to the person who's hyperprotective. But the price they pay for that is that they're not sufficiently competent. And then something happens in their life, often in their 40s. They develop heart palpitations, maybe as a consequence of menopause. Their heart starts to beat erratically, and they think, oh no, death. It's like, well, who are you going to talk to about that? right? There's no protection from authority for that. Or maybe their friend gets divorced, or maybe their sister dies, or something like that. It brings up the specter of mortality, and maybe the specter of malevolence and mortality, and it brings it up in a way that authority, recourse to authority, cannot solve. And so then they have panic attacks. What happens? They go out, they get afraid, they feel their heart beating, then they get afraid of their heart beating because they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and I'm going to make a fool of myself while I'm doing it and attract a lot of attention. So the two big fears come up: mortality and social judgment. And then they have a panic attack. It's like fight or flight's gone out of control. Very, very unpleasant. Then they start to avoid the places they've had a panic attack. Then they end up not being able to go anywhere. So then Tiamat has come back, right? A huge monster, a little victim. And so what do you do with them? Well, there's no saying, no, there's no Tiamat. That's done, right? Their naivety is over. They've had a direct contact with the threat of mortality and social judgment. They've met the terrible mother and they've met the terrible father. And there's no going back. There's no saying, oh, the world is safe. It's not safe. Not at all. It's not safe. The fact that you think it's safe means that you were living in an unconscious bubble that was sort of provided to you by your culture. It's a gift. And now that's been shattered. And so now what do you do? Well, the answer is you retreat until you're in your house and there's nowhere you can go. You're the ultimate frozen rabbit, right? And your life is hell because you can't function. The alternative is, let's take apart the things you're afraid of. Let's expose you to them, carefully and programmatically. And then you'll learn that you're actually tougher than you think. You never knew that. And maybe you didn't want to take on the responsibility because, people play a role in their own demise, so to speak. When you had opportunity to go out and explore or withdraw because you were afraid, you chose to withdraw because you were afraid. So it's not only that you were overprotected often, it's that you were willing to take advantage of the fact that you were overprotected and run back there whenever you had the opportunity. So maybe you're a kid in the playground, right, and you're having some trouble with other kids, and in the back of your mind, I should deal with this myself, but you go and tell your mom and get her to intervene. And you know that that's not right. You know that you're breaking the social contract, but it's easier, and so that's what you do. You run off to an authority figure and hide behind the Great Father, roughly speaking. Well, the problem with that is you don't learn how to do it yourself. So then you have to relearn it painfully when you're 40. So then you take people out, you say, well, what are you afraid of? Rank it from 1 to 10. So 10 is, make a list of 10 things you're afraid of. The thing you're least afraid of we'll call number 10. So we'll start with that. Okay, well, I'm afraid of elevators. Okay, well, let's look at a picture of an elevator. Let's have you imagine being in an elevator. Let's go out to an elevator and let you watch the terrible jaws of death open, because that's how you're responding to it symbolically, right? And you're going to do that at the closest proximity you can manage. You find out, you go do that, it works. You're nervous as hell, especially from an anticipatory perspective. Shaking. You go out, you stop, you watch it happen, and you actually calm down. You do that 10 times and it no longer bothers you. Well, what you've learned that you didn't die, but more importantly than that, you've learned that you could withstand the threat of death. That's what you've learned. And then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and finally you're back in what's no longer the elevator from a symbolic perspective. It's a tomb, right? It's a place of enclosure and isolation. And you learn, turns out I can withstand that. And then you're much more together, much more confident. And that's often one of the things that often happens in situations like that. I've seen this multiple times, is that if you run someone through an exposure training process like that and toughen them up, they'll often start standing up to people around them in a way they never did before, because they wouldn't stand up for themselves before, because they weren't willing to undermine the protection. See, if you're protecting me, I can't bother you, because I can't afford to forsake your protection. So if I'm going to play that game, I'm going to hide behind you, then I can't challenge you. So that's no good, because that's sometimes why people, you see this with guys very frequently, they're still deathly afraid of their father's judgment when they're in their 30s or 40s. It's like, well, why? No, because they still want to believe that there's someone out there that knows. And so they're willing to accept the subjugation, because it doesn't force them to challenge the idea that there's someone out there that knows. Because that's the advantage of having your father as a judge, right? Because he knows. Well, what if he doesn't? What if no one knows any better than you? well, that's a rough thing. You don't, until you realize that, you're not an adult, right? That's really technically the point of realization of adulthood, is that no one actually knows what you should do more than you do. I mean, it's a horrible realization, because what the hell do you know? It's a terrible realization, and people will often pick slavery, permanent slavery, to the spirit of the Great Father, let's say, over that realization, and it's completely understandable. But the problem with it is that there's more to you than you think, and so if you continue to hide behind that figure, then you never have a chance to understand that there's more to you than you think, far more to you than you think. Maybe there's enough to you so that you can actually withstand the threat of mortality without collapsing. Maybe even withstand the threat of malevolence without collapsing. Who knows? It's certainly possible. And it's not an abstract question. It's exactly the sort of question that you address in the psychotherapeutic process. It's always the question that you address. And the answer is often in the affirmative, because people can get unbelievably tough. And you know that because people work in emergency wards in hospitals, right? Or they work in palliative care wards, or they work as mortuary assistants. I mean, these people have bloody rough jobs, you know, or they're on the front line of police investigation into, you know, heinous child abuse crimes, and so they're confronting malevolence on a regular basis. And, you know, those are very stressful jobs, but people do them. And some people do them without even being damaged by them, although that's a harder thing, because you can see horrible things, you know, things you'll never forget.
This is something that I've actually relied on a little bit myself. Whenever I get to a low point where I think, why do I even bother? I just remind myself, this is where most people stop, and this is why they don't win. And this relates to another one, which is a reminder for the gladiators in the arena who feel beat up and scarred with no hope in sight. Building a business is hard. Hard feels shitty. This is what hard feels like. And this is why most people can't do it, but you can.
Most people do is they back away from adversity. But if you want to see if you're a brave person, wait when things go completely to pieces, when things are the worst, when your very best deal falls apart and your rent is late and you're tired and you're sick and everybody is mad at you and your car doesn't work, then it's the person that picks themselves up and says nothing is going to stop me.
You want to become best, you want to become champion, and now you want to say like you tired? Who cares? You tired or not? Nobody cares about you. He was tired, he have personal problem, family, nobody cares. You don't know, like, you just see how he fight and he go.
Yeah.
And for this one, you have to train so hard. If you don't want, halas, go back to Dagestan. Nobody gonna ask about yourself. If without you or with you, there is always gonna be champions. With your name, this is your choice. You wanna put your name there? Okay, work hard. No? Bye-bye.
You know, the war that you have to really fight is the war against yourself. You have to fight the war against yourself. Now, it's not easy to look in the mirror and to change your own life. It's hard as hell. You have to take responsibility. You have to learn new things. You have to feel uncomfortable. Good, because discomfort is how we grow. That's how we become strong. If you run away from discomfort and resistance your whole life, you will always be weak.
I don't look at failure as failure. I look at failure as your first, second, third, fourth, fifth attempt. I look at them as attempts. I don't look at anything as failure. Because when you're going to try to do something, not trying is failure. That's not some after school special shit. But when you're able to go out there, there is no failure. It's attempts. Because when you're trying to do something that's bigger than you, whatever you are, whoever you are, if you're paralyzed, you're trying to walk one step and you didn't fail, motherfucker. That's your first attempt. If that's your biggest thing, that's how your mindset needs to go into everything. So I don't look at it as failure is a big word like that gets people down and it gives so much power to words. I don't. I take the power right away. I didn't fail shit.
I think being the greatest musician of the 20th century is anybody's idea of success.
Dying broke and drunk and full of heroin at the age of 34 is not exactly my idea of success.
I'd rather die drunk, broke at 34 and have people at a dinner table talk about me than live to be rich and sober at 90 and nobody remember who I was.
When I think about how hard I want to work, the interesting thing about that is that the only person who can judge you on your success is you, because you're the only one who knows how much left in the tank you really had. And the better you get, and you can resonate with this, you start winning exteriorly. And that's when people are like, it felt so empty. It's because they didn't actually work as hard as they could have. They just worked hard enough to beat everyone else. But that discrepancy between how hard you could have worked to work your hardest versus what was required in order to win, to me, that's the opportunity that shifting towards the work being the goal unlocks for you. And I work harder now than I did when I was poor. And I think it's because I've learned to enjoy it.
It's like when I was losing 106 pounds in 3 months, the first 2 months or first 2 weeks, it's like I was gaining weight. You know, I would lose a pound, gain 2. So I was just failing. I kept failing and kept failing and kept failing. So I had to teach myself how to fail right. And what that means is when I fail, I can't spend much time in that fail zone. I have to be able to get up and get after the next day just as fast, because my goals were to be a Navy SEAL. I don't have time to stay here and feel bad for myself for weeks and months and years, because I'll lose that time. So the big thing is know that if you have big goals and big dreams, along the way, failure is going to happen. So how fast do you get up from that? And you gotta teach yourself that.
Go back to the gym, work, because you have more to show. You understand? Life continue. You cannot live in the past. I'm really good on that, you understand? I learned by the years that, listen, Cristiano, let's go. Because pain, you're gonna have all the time, uncertainty and constant work. Constant work, constant work. Doesn't matter what's happening. It's gonna happen in your life. You have to continue. This is the way I see the life.
So this guy just passed me. He said, Goggins, just be average today. Some of you just don't understand. Some of you have been average for so damn long, you don't know what it is to do hard work. But there's a lot of you out there who want to be much more than average, but just don't know how to do it every single day, the grind. You need to find someone to oil those gears up. So check it out. This is a mindset. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But there's a motherfucker out there who wants what you have, who wants the position you are, who wants the job you have, who wants the wife that you have, or the husband. There's someone out there hungry and wants everything you have. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But if it is, it's gonna be your. So make that a motivation for you.
It's known from multiple dimensions simultaneously that the system that produces happiness, let's say in the founder's sense, produces that emotion in relationship to the observation of movement towards a valued goal. And so you can derive some conclusions from that. The first is that without a goal, there's no happiness by definition, because happiness marks movement towards a valued goal. The next is, well, the higher the goal, the more value there is in the observation of movement towards it. And so out of that, you might ask, well, then what's the highest goal? Because why don't we go for that? Well, then you could say, well, you should do your best for the best. You might say, well, that's just to make me hedonically happy. It's like, well, wait a second, you know, cocaine will work for that, because it actually even activates this system. But what about tomorrow and next week and next month? And so the problem with hedonism as a goal is, first of all, it vanishes when you're suffering. But even failing that, if you're serving yourself hedonically in the narrow sense, it's just about me and my pleasure. It's like, okay, which you? Today's you, tomorrow's you, next week's you, next month's you. What about next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? You're going to lead a hedonic and dissolute life, and what are you going to be, a burnt-out shell and a wreck, a dismal wreck in 10 years? Because that's what'll happen. And so if you don't construe yourself as a community stretched out across time, then you're not even serving yourself. And if you do construe yourself as a community stretched across time, then serving other people and serving yourself turn out to be exactly the same thing. I just did a course on the Sermon on the Mount, and Christ, in one of the sections of that sermon, he says to people that you shouldn't lose your saltiness, you shouldn't lose your savor. And
And you're the salt of the earth, and without that salt, everything loses its flavor. And salt is a preservative, and it's a spice, and that's often conceptualized, that phrase, as referring to the salt of the earth, you know, the solid, reliable types who bear all burdens. But that is not what it means. I looked at a lot of different translations. I talked to a lot of people about that verse, and really what it means is, well, there should be some spiciness and unpredictability and humor about you. And there should be some play in the system, right? Because that's what stops you from just being the narrow, dead, past letter of the law with no spirit. There should be some snake inside the tree, right? There should be some fire inside the bush. Those are all ways of construing that are symbolically equivalent. There should be some dynamism in you, and a fair bit of that's associated with, well, enthusiasm. That's fun, but enthusiasm means to be imbued with the Spirit of God. That's why people like comedians so much too, because that's what they do. And so you have to leaven the duty with humor, and your book does a lovely job of that too, because your book, which is a very conservative book in the best possible way, and is a call to duty and responsibility, but you constantly return to themes of both stoicism and humor, which are tied together in some sense, you know. I was just in Newfoundland for the last week doing a documentary there, and Newfoundland's a rough rock, and it's beautiful and harsh, and the people there are tough and resilient, man, because they had to be. And Newfies have a great sense of humor, and they're always making fun, and that's a necessary leaven, right? That ability to deal with serious matters with a light touch, and it's something I'm trying to learn to do more and more, even in the most serious of conversations, you know, too. Because if you're a master, you've got both. You've got that light touch and that sense of humor. You really see that in military people who've been through rough situations. Well, this is the development of a vision. Now, you can construe consciousness as the implementer of the vision in the broadest sense. So what we really confront as human beings isn't a deterministic world that runs like clockwork, that the past pushes forward in an algorithmic or deterministic manner. That isn't how the world works. The way the world works is that we confront a horizon of possibility that's not predictable. It's somewhat predictable the way a musical piece is predictable. So it's rule governed, but it's not predictable in a deterministic way. And it's full of possibility and potential. That's actually its nature. It's potential in its nature. And to maximize the quality of our interaction with that potential, we have to impose a vision on it and then pursue the vision. And so when you do the future authoring program, well, that's what you're trying to do, is develop a vision. So here's the first exercise. It's like, okay, here's the deal, all right? You get to have what you need and what you want. Maybe even better, you get to have what you need and want if you were treating yourself properly. So imagine, first of all, that you were treating yourself properly because you actually cared for yourself.
Okay, and say you don't.
Yeah, well, you don't.
How do you help somebody?
Well, you at least ask them to open the door to the possibility that maybe they could. So just imagine that you did. Not that you are, that you could, but that you tried. Think, okay, I'm a valuable person, maybe. And if I was treating myself like I had intrinsic value, like if you were treating yourself like you were someone you loved, so you could imagine doing this for someone you actually cared about. Because most people care about someone that isn't them.
So do you identify someone you care about?
Well, you can, yes, you can, and say, because it does tell you, it's like, well, if you're not so good at caring for yourself, imagine someone you love and then pretend that you're bringing that attitude to bear on you with all your faults and inadequacies. I'm not being casual about this. It's hard for people to do this, right? Because we know our own flaws so deeply. It's hard for us to take care of ourselves. But imagine that you should take care of yourself and that you could and that you did. Just imagine that. So that's opening up at least the door, right?
Yeah.
And then you say, well, 5 years down the road, you get to have what you want and need. What is it? And so this is a deep question. So, because the question is this: your life is going to be difficult, and it's going to be marked by suffering and tragedy in all sorts of different ways.
disappointment and obstacle and betrayal and the whole panoply of human catastrophe, that's absolutely 100% definitely coming your way. Okay, so given that, and given that you want to live a life free of resentment and bitterness and premature aging and excess suffering, and that you don't want to be a burden to everyone around you, what would you have to make carrying that weight worthwhile? That's a hard question, you know. It's like, what justifies your suffering? That isn't how am I going to be happy. It's what justifies your suffering. Well, ask yourself. You get to have what you want. If you were taking care of yourself, what would it be? Okay, and so you write for 15 minutes about what your life might be like 5 years down the road if you got to have what you needed and wanted. And then we concretize it. You know, I had lots of clients and students who said, well, I don't know what to do with my life. What should I do with my life? And the first answer to that question is, that's not a very good question. Because it's like, what, do you want a one-line answer to what you should do with your life? Like, life is everything, and you want a one-line answer to everything. No. Bad question. You can imagine a desirable future, but it helps to particularize it. So one of the things you might ask is, where do people find meaning? And the answer is, well, in multiple places. Here's some places people typically find meaning. So if clients came to me and they were depressed, first of all, I'd try to find out, are you depressed? Or do you just have a terrible life, or some combination of those two? And you might ask, what's the difference? And that's a really good question. If you're depressed, you have a good life, but you're suffering. So what would it mean that you have a good life? Well, it means somewhat different things to different people, but you can kind of triangulate on it. Probably you have an intimate relationship, or at least you have the prospects of one. So at least you want one, and you believe that maybe you could have one if you don't have one, and probably if you have a good life, you have one. You have some friends. They're real friends, right? You have some family members, children perhaps, if not children, parents and siblings, or perhaps both, grandchildren. You're nested inside a family, and your relationships with your family are desirable. You have a job or a career, and so if it's a job, well, then it's hard, and maybe you wouldn't have picked it as a vocation, but at least maybe you have good relationships with your coworkers, and you're doing something difficult, but that's actually socially productive and useful and generates an income, so that's not nothing. You're educated to the level of your intellectual capability, or you have plans to do so. You're taking care of yourself mentally and physically, and you have a strategy for dealing with the realm of signal temptation, drug and alcohol abuse and sexual misbehavior and that sort of thing. And then we've added one more recently, at least conceptually, that you've adopted a certain degree of civic responsibility, right? You're participating in the broader community in some manner. And if you're doing none of those, my life is meaningless. Are you doing any of these? No. Well, that's why it's meaningless. Those are the domains of meaning. If you're miserable and you have none of those things, the first thing to do, if you're a cognitive behavioral therapist with someone, is to say, well, how about we work on like one of these things to begin with? You know, you need some friends. You need to get out in the dating market. You need a job or a better job. You need an educational plan. Like, you don't have a life, so of course you're miserable, because without sustaining life, without sustaining meaning, life is just tragedy. And so your lot is misery. And so anyways, we ask people to go through these 8 different domains and say, okay, you can have what you want, but you have to aim at it. Sin means to miss the mark, by the way. It means to miss the target. That's what takes you away from God, is to miss the target. What target? Yeah, right. What target? Right. You got to at least know there's a target, then you got to try to hit it. You know, and maybe you don't even know where the target is, but your aim isn't good, but at least you've set up a target now, and you can practice. And so, well, if you had an intimate relationship, what would it look like? If you had some friends, how would you like those friendships to be conducted? If you had a job or a career, what could it be if you had what you wanted? In the future authoring program, which is the one we've done the most research on, so if people do this for 90 minutes badly before they go to college, it'll decrease the probability they'll drop out in the first year by 50%.
That's amazing.
And it works particularly well for people who are most likely to drop out. So a lot of psychological interventions help the good performers do even better and don't help the bad performers that much.
And why do you think it helps them more?
Well, I think the good performers already have a bit of a vision and a plan, whereas the bad performers, they're really ambivalent about what they're doing because they don't have a plan. And we'll talk more about why this is so important. If you don't have a reason to do something, and then a reason not to do it comes up, well, then you just not do it, because not doing things is real easy. You can just sit there and not do things all day. Doing things takes effort, and so any resistance is likely to, it pushes back against you. And so going to college, it's like, well, why is that difficult? Well, you have to get up, you have to go to your classes, you have to do the assignments, you have to do the reading, you have to write the tests, you have to believe that this path is somehow better than any other path you could be on, and there's innumerable other paths, and that it's better in some fundamental sense than just doing nothing or playing games or being purely hedonic. So there's a lot of, because it's difficult, there's a lot of obstacles. And if you don't have a reason, well, why would you overcome the obstacles? And so what happens when you do the future authoring program is two things. Is first of all, you construe yourself as the sort of person who could have a reason, right? Who could make a vision and impose it on the world.
And how do you do that?
Well, and then second, you actually develop a vision. Okay, so the first thing the program asks you to do, and it's got a biblical element to it in some fundamental sense, although that wasn't so explicit when we first developed it, but I came to realize that later. There's a statement in the Gospels. Christ says to his followers, ask and you'll receive. Knock and the door will open. Seek and you'll find. And you listen to that and you think, no way, man, it can't be that easy. Well, it's that easy. Because let's think about what wanting means. You want something. You want to find, so you'll seek. How hard are you going to seek? You know, maybe you're after the Holy Grail, right? You're after the gold in the dragon's lair, or the jewel in the toad's head. You're after something that's guarded by some monstrous figure. You're going to seek? How committed to that are you? And there's a total commitment in that in a fundamental way. It's like you should be humble enough to be open to learning, to radical transformation, to the probability that you're really wrong if you're not finding what you're seeking, and the willingness to sacrifice virtually everything of lesser value for that goal. Otherwise, you do not want it. You did not ask. You are not seeking. You did not knock on the door. You could think, even as an exercise, you could think, well, what qualities of a human being do I find admirable? You have to ask yourself that, in a sense. You can't really think about it. There is a difference between asking yourself a question and thinking about it. You know, because it's more like when you're asking yourself a question, it's contemplative. It's like, well, what do I find admirable? It's a question. You don't know. And if you're fortunate, and this happens quite regularly, an answer will float up from wherever the hell answers float up, and you know, oh yeah, that's one, and you can write that down, and you get some idea of what your ideal is, you know, and you have one likely, and what your counter ideal is. Star. Well, to wish upon a star is to raise your eyes above the horizon and to focus on something transcendent that's beyond you. To focus on the absolute, we could say, to focus on the light that shines in the darkness. Now, a star is, people wear diamonds because they're like stars, or they're like the sun, and they're pure and perfect, and they glitter. And so there's something about the light too. There's something about a source of light. It's a source of illumination and enlightenment. And the light that shines in the darkness is a deep metaphor, right? It's what you want. You want a light to shine in the darkness. And so the star has all that. And so people wish upon a star because they have some intuition that aiming above the mundane has the potential to transform themselves. They make a wish. Well, if you're going to make a wish, you should aim at something high. And even just aiming at that is more likely to make the wish come true. And this is not metaphor. You know, I have this program which you guys are going to do called the Future Authoring Program. It's one of two assignments. One is that you write an autobiography, that's the past authoring. The other is that you write a plan for the future, that's the future authoring. I would recommend that you get started on those right now, like not right now, but like really soon, because they're harder than you think. And some of you are going to write like 15,000 words. You're going to get sucked right in. This happens all the time. You're going to get sucked right into it. And so you write an autobiography because you need to know where you are and who you are right now, because how the hell are you going to plot a pathway to the future unless you know where you are? And then you need to write about the future, because you aren't going to hit something unless you aim at it. That's for sure. And lots of times people won't aim at what they want because they're afraid. The reason they're afraid is because if you specify what you want, you've specified your conditions of failure. You know when you fail. And it's better just to keep it foggy. It's like, well, I don't know if I'm succeeding or failing, but you know, I can't really tell. Well, great, except you can't hit anything you don't aim at. And so the future authoring program is like it's an attempt to have you articulate your character. And so is the past authoring program. Who are you? And you know, the past authoring program, it asks you to break your life into epochs and then to write about the emotional, you know, the things that you regard as important events that have shaped who you are. And you know, you may find that some of that writing makes you emotional. And I would say, if you have a memory that's more than 18 months old, roughly speaking, and when you bring it to mind, it has an emotional impact, especially a negative emotional impact. It's like part of your soul is stuck back there. And I know that's a metaphorical way of thinking about it, but what I mean is that the reason that you still experience the emotion is because you have not solved the problem that situation faced you with. It might be a real problem, like maybe you got tangled up with someone who was really bad, and that's rough, man, because you've got to come up with a theory of malevolence to deal with something like that, and that's no joke. But if it still produces emotion, it means you haven't solved the problem, and your brain is still tagging it as threat. It's a part of your territory that you did not master. Threat, 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 threat. And until you take it apart, and articulation really helps that, writing really helps that, then you're not going to free yourself from its grip. And that might not be that pleasant. I mean, this is one of those situations where doing it tends to produce a decrement in people's mood in the short term, but quite radical improvements 3 to 6 months down the road. You know, and it's often the case that you unfortunately have to do something you don't want to do in order to progress. It's very, very common. So, and the future authoring program asks you about different dimensions of your life, like, because you know, you can think of yourself as a personality inside your head, but you're nested in systems that transcend you, and they're just as real as whatever's in your head. It's like, well, what do you need for life? Well, that's pretty easy actually. Some friends, that's a good thing. Intimate relationship, that's a good thing. A family, you know, either the one you're going to produce or the one that you come from, where people to some degree love and care for one another. That's a good thing to work on. You need some plan for your career. You've got to fit in somewhere that people regard as important and that they'll trade with you so that you can live. You need something worthwhile to do with the time that you're not at work, and you need to pay attention to your mental and physical health, and you need to regulate your use of substances, which is a strange one, but alcohol does lots of people in, so it's worth thinking about. That's why we put it in there. So then it's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What do you want from your friends? What do you want from your family? What do you want from your career? If you could have what you wanted, and that's what the program asks you, 3 to 5 years down the road, you get to have what you want. Now, I'm assuming that you're going to approach this like, you know, reasonable adults and not like 13-year-old dreamers. I think I want the most expensive yacht in the world. It's like, fine, but you know, that isn't really what it's supposed to be. More concentrating on your character. And so then it asks you to write for 15 minutes without thinking too much about grammar or sentence structure or any of that, about what your life could be like 3 to 5 years down the road if you were treating yourself like someone you cared for and you were helping them figure out what they wanted. And then it asks you to do the same thing in reverse, which is to think about the ways that you're radically insufficient and your faults. And everyone knows this, I think, you know, maybe not, but everyone has a sense of if they were going to degenerate, how they would do it. You know, some people would be an alcoholic, some people would be a street person. It's like there's some doom thing out there that's got your name on it if you're particularly incautious and, you know, don't and let things fall apart. So I want you to write about that. What do you not want to have happen in 3 to 5 years? And there's psychological reasons for this. One is, if you have something to aim for, that's a source of positive emotion, because your positive emotion is mostly generated by evidence that you're moving towards something that you value. It's not generated so much by accomplishing something, because when you accomplish something, you're just left with the problem of whatever you're going to do next. So you graduate from university, it's like, you know, hooray, one day you're at the peak of your undergraduate university career, the next day you're unemployed and looking for a bad job at Starbucks. So, you know, well, you see what I mean, is, you know, it's that, you know, one problem that you solve is replaced by another problem, and so the idea that you're going to be happy when you solve all your problems is like, haha, good luck with that theory. But, you know, if you're aiming at something worthwhile, and you really believe it's worthwhile, and you've thought it through, you know, so that you're not weak, you've got your damn arguments mustered, then when you make progress, even a little bit, you think, hey, that's all right, and you get a little kick, you get a little dopamine kick, and that's what you want, because that's where your positive emotion comes from. You can use cocaine if you want, but but you know, that tends to have relatively detrimental medium to long-term consequences, but it activates the same system. So you have to be aiming at something, and you should be aiming at something that's realistic, that you want, that you could get, you know, like not easily, because if it's easy, in some sense you've already got it. It's got to push you, that's part of the pleasure, actually, because there's two things that you want to do when you're pursuing something that's important, and one of them is to get the thing that's important, but the other is to make yourself better at pursuing things, right? So you can get both of those at the same time. You're aiming at something and you're increasing your competence. It's like, that's a good deal, and there's a lot of intrinsic meaning to be felt in that. And then the second half of the program, you write out a plan for how you're going to do it, and how you're going to keep yourself on track, and you're going to write about why it would be good for you if you did this, and why it would be good for your family, and what possible benefits it would have to the community, you know, because you want to nail this thing down, and then you want to figure out what kind of obstacles are going to come up, and how you might overcome them, and how you might keep yourself on track, and all of that. And we know, because we've actually done a lot of research on this particular program, that if university students do this, and this is more true if they're not too well oriented to begin with, if university students do this, they're about 25% less likely to drop out, which is a lot, and about their grade point average increases about 20%. So hooray for that, you know, because you never know when you develop an intervention if it's going to work. There's also evidence, but not from my lab, that doing such things improves your physical health, and I think the reason for that is that, you know, when you go over your autobiography and you scour out those negative places that you're sort of dragging along with you, it lowers your overall stress load, because your brain is kind of, I think it's calculating how dangerous the world is by attending to the ratio of successes to failures that you've had in your life, something like that. And so, you know, if there are holes in your map that you could still fall through, then your brain regards the territory still as a bit on the dangerous side, and then you're more prepared for emergency action, and that's hard on you. So you want to go back there and fix up those experiences. So, you know, one way of conceptualizing yourself is that you're one speck of dust among 7 billion. And when you conceptualize yourself that way, you might think, well, what difference does it make what I say or do? And that's actually quite convenient for you, because if it doesn't matter what you say or do, then you don't have any responsibility and you can do whatever you want. The price you pay for that is a bit of nihilism, but if you don't have to shoulder any responsibility, that's a small price to pay. Another That's the underground motivation for nihilism. But the other way of looking at it, and this is actually the accurate way of looking at it, is that you're in a network. You're a node in a network. And so you can do a little bit of arithmetic very rapidly and just figure out how powerful you are. You know 1,000 people. You're going to know more than that over the course of your life, but let's say 1,000 for the sake of argument for now. They know 1,000 people. That means that you're one person away from 1,000,000 people and 2 persons away from 1,000,000,000 people. And you're the center of that network. And now the way networks work is that information propagates in a networked manner. So don't underestimate the power of your speech. Now, you know, Western culture is phallogocentric. Let's say it. Okay, so we'll say, yeah, that's just fine. That's exactly what it is. It's predicated on the idea of the logos, that the logos is the sacred element of Western culture. And what does that mean? It means that your capacity for speech is divine. It's the thing that generates order from chaos and then sometimes turns pathological order into chaos when it has to. Don't underestimate the power of truth. There's nothing more powerful. Now, in order to speak what you might regard as the truth, you have to let go of the outcome. You have to think, all right, I'm going to say what I think, stupid as I am, biased as I am, ignorant as I am. I'm going to state what I think as clearly as I can, and I'm going to live with the consequences no matter what they are. Now, the reason you think that, that's an element of faith. The idea is that nothing brings a better world into being than the stated truth. Now, you might have to pay a price for that, but that's fine. You're going to pay a price for every bloody thing you do and everything you don't do. You don't get to choose to not pay a price. You get to choose which poison you're going to take. That's it. So if you're going to stand up for something, stand up for your truth. It'll shape you because people will respond and object and tell you why you're a fool and a biased moron and why you're ignorant. And then if you listen to them, you'll be just that much less like that the next time you say something. And if you do that for 5 years, you'll be so damn tough and articulate and able to communicate and withstand pressure that you won't even recognize yourself. And then you'll be a force to contend with. And you don't get to wait until, because I get letters like Gad Saad gets all the time too, from faculty members in particular, and they say, well, you know, when I get tenure, it's like, then they think, well, when I'm an associate professor, and then they think, well, when I'm a full professor, it's like, if you're a professor already, you're like the most protected person in the history of the planet, you know, and you need, well, okay, but one of the things that indicates is that it's almost impossible to provide people with enough protection so that they feel safe to speak. Okay, so we'll address that directly. It is not safe to speak, and it never will be. But the thing you got to keep in mind is that it's even less safe not to speak. Right? It's a balance of risks. It's like you want to pay the price for being who you are and stating your mode of being in the world, or do you want to pay the price for being a bloody serf, one that's enslaved him or herself? Well, that's a major price, man. That thing unfolds over decades, and you'll just be a miserable worm at the end of about 20 years of that, right? No self-respect, no power, no ability to voice your opinions, nothing left but resentment because everyone's against you, because of course you've never stood up for yourself. It's like, say what you think carefully, pay attention to your words. The price is, it's a price you want to pay if you are willing to believe that truth is the cornerstone of society. And in the most real sense, if you're willing to take that leap, then tell the truth and see what happens. And nothing better could possibly happen to you. There'll be ups and downs, and there'll be pushback, and there'll be controversy and all of that, but it doesn't matter. The truth is what makes the world, the truth is what redeems the world from hell, and that's the truth. And we saw plenty of hell over the last 100 years, you know, and we haven't learned a bloody thing from it. It's like, wake up, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. That's a start. And you got to understand that's a risk. But I have one more brief thing to say about that. So, you know, I said what I had to say back in September, and I'm sure that I could have done it better, and many people have told me how I could have done it better, although it didn't mean they would actually do it, but and, you know, my job was at risk, serious risk, for about 2 months, and it destabilized my family, who've been very brave about this. So, like, thumbs up to them, man. They've just stood by me.
But here's the optimistic news, is the university has left me alone completely. I shook hands with the dean 2 weeks ago. We're on friendly terms. They don't want this to go any farther than it has already. The students were tremendously welcoming when I came back to teach in January. I haven't had a single negative incident at the university. And I've received thousands of letters from people all over the world, all of which have been in support. I've received 2 negative letters. That's it. 2. So the people have an inchoate longing to have the sort of thing that we're talking about articulated. And so don't be thinking you're alone. It's just that people can't talk, they're afraid to talk, or they don't know what to say. And those are real problems. So if you're reasonably articulate, like, start talking and sharpen yourself up. I mean, the enemy is a cloud. They're a cloud of gnats. They're only courageous in groups. They're only courageous in mobs. If you stand your ground and don't apologize and articulate things properly, they'll disperse around you like they're not even there. So most of it's illusion. So don't be afraid, but be afraid of the right thing. And the right thing you should be afraid of is not saying what you say, because that's the same as not being. And here you are, suffering away. You might as well be at the same time. At least then there's something to you. So.
That's Nietzsche's realization. He said, look, imagine that you live within a belief system, and then something arises to challenge the belief system. Not only does the belief system collapse, but something worse happens. Your belief in belief systems collapses. And that's the road to not. Now, it doesn't have to, because you can jump from one belief system to another. But sometimes that doesn't work, is that you do a meta-critique and you say, oh, I was living in this protective structure and it turned out to be flawed. Okay, one alternative is jump to another protective structure. Fine. Another alternative is protective structures themselves are not to be trusted. Bang, you're in chaos. How the hell are you going to get out of that? That's the pathway to nihilism. Well, you can work your way through that. That's difficult. Or you can do what Jung would regard as a soul-damaging move, and you can sacrifice your new knowledge and re-identify with something rigid and restricted, which is what I would say is happening to some degree with the people in Europe who are turning to a regressive nationalism as an alternative to the current state of chaos. It's like, I know that people need to identify with local groups. I understand that. But they risk the danger of making the state the ultimate God. And that's order, but that's not a good replacement for chaos. It's just another kind of catastrophe, right? Too much order, too much chaos, both catastrophes. You want to stand in the middle somehow and mediate between the two, and that's where you have your real strength. Because then it isn't that you've discovered a safe place. Because even the bloody right-wingers are after a safe place, right? They just want it to be the state. Yeah, exactly. Well, there's no safe places. And the next issue is, do you really want a safe place? Is that what you want? You want to be so weak that you want to be protected from threat? What the hell kind of life is that? You're a paralyzed rabbit in a hole. That's no life for a human being. You should be confronting danger and the unknown and malevolence, because, and the reason for that too is, this is the weird paradox. And I believe this is the paradox, first of all, that was discovered in part by Buddha, but also laid forth very clearly in Christianity, which is that the solution to the problem of tragedy and malevolence is the willingness to face them. Now, who the hell would ever guess that? It's a completely paradoxical suggestion. Is that, well, why does it work? Well, because the more you confront the two of them, the more you grow. And maybe you can grow so that you're actually larger than the chaos and malevolence itself. And you think, well, what's the evidence for that? And that's easy. That's what people do. That is how we learn. Like, every time you expose your child to something new, a playground, what are they exposed to? Chaos and malevolence. Now, there's more to it than that, obviously, because kids play and they promote each other and they form friendships and all of that. But in the playground itself, there is the complexity of the social structure and the malevolence of the bully. It's right there. And you throw your kid in there and you say, adapt, and they do. Okay, so they can do it at a small scale. It's not trivial. The playground's a complicated place. The kid can adapt. Well, how much can you scale that up? Can you scale that up from the chaos and order and malevolence of the playground to chaos and order and malevolence itself? Well, that's the question. Well, I don't think there's any reason to answer that in the negative. So, because we don't know the full extent of a human being. And it is the problem that's worked out. So in the Buddha story, for example, what happens after, so Buddha's world collapses in the same way that Adam and Eve's world collapses. It's a consequence of repetitive exposure to mortality and death. What happens to Buddha is he realizes that the little protected city that his father made for him, the walled garden, it's exactly the same motif that's in this Adam and Eve story, it's fatally flawed. That kind of protection cannot exist, and he discovers that in pieces, right? Which is exactly what happens to children, is that they go out, they discover a limit, they run back. And the parents can help them with the limit. They run out, they discover a limit, they run back. But at some point they run out, they discover a limit, they run back, and the parents have nothing to say to them. Because they've hit the same limit that the parents hit. Which is like, well, what are you going to do with your life? How are you going to operate in this archetypal universe? Well, your parents can only say, well, they can say you identify with the proper archetypal figures. They do that, they at least act that out for you, but at some point it's a problem that they cannot solve for you without making you weaker. That's the thing, you know. So it's an interesting thing that I've learned in therapy, because one of the things you have to learn as a therapist is how do you not take your client's problems home with you. It's a very common existential problem that beginning therapists face because they're afraid. It's like, well, you're dealing with people all the time who have serious problems. Sometimes it's mental illness, although less frequently than you'd think. And sometimes it's just that they're having a good catastrophe, right? Their parents have cancer or something like that, or their father has Alzheimer's and they're unemployed, or they have a drug problem, or they have a schizophrenic son, or like, these aren't mental illness problems, right? Those are just catastrophes. And so people are discussing those with you all the time. How do you avoid being crushed by that or avoid taking it home? And the answer to that is you don't steal the problem. That's the answer. It's like, you have some problems. If you come and talk to me, I'll help you figure out how to solve them. I will not tell you how to solve them. I won't steal your problems. Because what we're trying to do in therapy is, number one, solve your problem. Number two, turn you into a great solver of problems. And the second one is way more important than the first one. And so you never solve someone's problem by removing from them the opportunity to solve their problem. That's theft. That's the Oedipal situation. That's the Oedipal situation. That's the overprotective mother. Now, father can play that role too. We're talking about archetypal representations. It's like, I'll protect you at the cost of your ability to protect yourself. No. Wrong. That's a sin. That's a good way of thinking about it. That is not what you do with people. Not with your children, not with your partner, not with yourself. You don't do that. That destroys people's adaptive competence. And it disarms them in the face of chaos and malevolence. And that's a terrible you're going to send someone out unarmed in a world like that? It's a terrible thing to do. So, and if people aren't strong enough to manage it, then they get resentful, and then, you know, you get the downhill spiral that goes along with that. Okay, so the meta story is partly you have a map, but it's insufficient, and things will come up to disrupt it, and sometimes the disruption is catastrophic. Everything falls apart. That's what happens to the Buddha, and that's what happens to Adam and Eve. And the rest of the biblical stories are actually an attempt to put that back together. Now, that's been assembled, as I said, it's been assembled over centuries, right? Okay, we've got the problem. The problem is the ever-present reality of the apocalyptic fall. That's the problem. And so you could say, well, what is that? It's the insufficiency of all potential conceptual schemes. Right. Your conceptual schemes are insufficient to deal with the complexity of the world. It's a permanent problem. So what do? You stop relying on your conceptual schemes. That's part of the answer. You start relying on instead on your ability to actively generate conceptual schemes in the face of chaos and malevolence. And so that makes you someone that identifies with your creative capacity, your creative, courageous capacity for articulation and action in the face of the unknown, rather than some formulaic approach to the territory. And the idea is that elevates your character to the point where you can withstand tragedy and malevolence without becoming corrupt. And that provides a permanent solution to the problem. Well, then you might say, cynically, what's your evidence that that's a permanent solution? And the answer to that is, well, the evidence isn't all in yet. First of all, because people only live that way partially. And so we haven't put the hypothesis to the full test. And second, we don't know what our limitations are. We have no idea what our limitations are. And they're both greater and lesser than we imagine. Because you have to ask yourself, like, if people stopped adding voluntarily to the misery of the world and devoted themselves to setting things straight, setting themselves straight and setting the things around them straight, what would happen? And the answer to that is, well, there'd be a hell of a lot less unnecessary misery in the world. So that might not be a bad place to start. But apart from that, there's very little that we can say. Could we overcome the catastrophe of mortality? Why not? You think that's beyond our capacity? Could we make the world a place where no one was suffering any more than necessary and still allow the world to exist? Well, possibly, because we don't know the limitations of our capacity. We're only running at 40%, if that, I would say. We don't make full use of all the people that are in the world. We don't have our situation set up so that the gifts that they could offer to everyone are fully realized. We haven't set the systems up for that yet, so we waste people like mad, and then we waste ourselves like mad. And so I would say this is something also that's one of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament Jews. This is, I think, one of the reasons that their book has become so central, is because what happens in the Old Testament after the fall is that Israel produces a series of states, right? Rise of state and then a fall, and then a rise of another state and then a fall. So it's the same thing, except it's happening at a political level. The political state rises, it gets corrupt, it falls. It rises out of the ashes again, gets corrupt, and falls. I think that happens 6 times in the Old Testament. And one of the things that's very interesting is the reaction of the Jews. They always say, it was our fault. Instead of taking the Cain and Abel route, so, and I'm going to tell you the Cain and Abel story right away. Instead of taking the Cain and Abel route, they always say, if the state collapsed, it was because we did something wrong. That's very different than saying, it's arbitrary fate. It's the nature of arbitrary fate, or the structure of reality, that we're doomed to collapse into chaos, and that's an indication of the corruption of being. Well, you can take that route if you want. It's the corruption of being. Well, good luck with that. So what are you going to do about that? That's easy. You'll start to work for the destruction of being. That's what you will do. The alternative is to say, this terrible thing happened and somehow it's my fault. Well, at least that opens you up the pathway to doing something about it, and maybe it's actually the case. Maybe terrible things happen because you're just not who you should be. At least it's that's true to some degree, right? You know it. Because things happen to you all the time and you think, well, if I just would have played that game straight, and if I would have put this thing in order, that wouldn't have happened. It's like, okay, fine. What's the ultimate extent of that? Dostoevsky said at one point that every human being was not only responsible for everything that happened to him or her, but also simultaneously responsible for everything that happened to everyone else. Now, I would say it's almost a hallucinogenic idea, right? It's a transcendent idea, and it can go very wrong. Sometimes depressed people, for example, get hyper-responsible for what's happened, and just crushes them. And so it's a mode of thinking that can produce its attendant pathologies. But there's something about it that's metaphysically true. Faith is a presupposition for living in the truth. And then you might ask yourself another question, which is, well, why bother living in the truth? Well, one answer would be so that reality doesn't rise up and smite you repeatedly, which it will, if you're deceptive. So that's one answer, but here's another answer, and this is a better answer. People ask themselves all the time, what's the purpose of life? And there's a variety of answers to that. There's no purpose. We're just atoms on a dust mote at the edge of a rather reprehensible corner of the cosmos, and we exist for a moment and we're out, and that's that. Or we're so lost in a plethora of subordinate meanings that we're confused and aimless. Or we want to be hedonistically happy, and I would say that's really the offer that's on the table in our culture most of the time. It's like, well, I just want to be happy. And people will say that to you. It's a slogan. It's the most common slogan of our time, I would say. And it's such a preposterous slogan. It's like, what do you mean just? You just want to be happy. That's all. That's all you want. That absolute impossibility. You want bliss unending, no matter what you do. And that's all you want. It's not exactly a small ask, let's say. Because it's the same thing as asking to dwell permanently in paradise. It's something like that. So, it's not that likely. And then, it also isn't true. That isn't what you want. If you do careful analysis of what people mean when they say they just want to be happy, what they mean is they don't want to suffer stupidly. We're much more concerned with not experiencing an excess of negative emotion than we are with experiencing a surfeit of positive pleasure. So first of all, we don't mean we just want to be happy. We mean, please don't make us too miserable. And fair enough, that's reasonable. But then even on the happiness front, even on the absence of misery front, that's not true. One of the things Dostoevsky pointed out in Notes from Underground, which is so bloody brilliant, he was criticizing the idea of materialist utopia. He said something like, well, imagine we made our materialist utopian dreams come true and everybody had enough to eat all the cakes they wanted and enough to drink and nothing to do, he said, but busy themselves with the continuation of the species. And we were so pleased that we emitted nothing but bubbles of bliss. He said, human beings were so damn ungrateful that the first thing we do is take a stick and smash up all that comfortable prosperity just so that something unexpected and provocative could happen. And that's very smart, you know, that's hearkening in some sense back to the story of the Garden of Eden and the proclivity of human beings to eat the forbidden fruit. It's like it isn't obvious at all that we want happiness. It isn't even obvious that we want absence of misery. What's really obvious is that we want an adventure, right? We want an adventure that's so compelling that it makes the misery of life not just justifiable, but worthwhile. You want to look back on your life, you know. You want to look back on your life, and you know this to be true. You want to be able to say to yourself, even considering a month or a week or a series of days, you want to be able to say, that was really difficult, but you know what? It was worth it. And I think that's what you want from your life. It's something like, you know what? That was difficult, but it was worth it. And that meant that the adventure was so great that it justified the difficulties. And so then the question is, and here's the question, where do you find the great adventure of your life? Well, how about in truth? Well, why? Because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth. It's a mystery. It's going to lay itself out for you. And so that's an adventure because you literally do not know what's going to happen. You have to let go of knowing what's going to happen. And so then you have that adventure, and then what is also the case is that it's you that's having the adventure, right? Because if what you're doing is living in truth, that's you, that truth is you. And so that means that whatever happens when you tell the truth is your adventure. And then you think, well, I'm using deception. It's like, well, maybe you are, but maybe deception is using you. And then maybe it's the spirit of deception that's having the adventure of your life. And then you might ask yourself, well, why are you so miserable and unhappy? And the answer would be, well, the spirit of deception is having the adventure of your life. You're not even there. Because if you're not living in truth, you're not there, obviously. What's there is the spirit of deception. And you might think that's your deception, but I would be very careful about thinking that, because there have been centuries of meditation on the nature of the spirit of deception. And the answer isn't that the spirit of deception is you. The answer is that the spirit of deception is something that possesses you and convinces you that it's you. And that's not something you want to fall into the clutches of. So, So now you have to tell me the question again.
I'm certain you answered it. This was about teenagers.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, back to the teenagers. Do you not want to go to college, or are you just lying about being lazy? So that's a question, and we can ask ourselves that question. And as I said, on the teenage front, craft a vision, you know, craft a compelling vision. That's really what we are as human beings, is we're visionaries. That's how we confront the horizon of the future. We meet the horizon of the future by crafting a compelling vision. And your vision might not involve a college education, but it should be a vision that makes you think, if I could make that come true, it would justify the trouble that it would take to manage it. And I think that's the right attitude to take towards your life. And you know, we're all going to have our crosses to bear in the most fundamental manner. We all have to deal with the catastrophe of mortality. And I think we all have to deal with the reality of hell. And you can think about that religiously or not. Political hell will do for hell as far as I'm concerned. We certainly saw no shortage of evidence for that in the 20th century. And we all have to contend with that, right? The reality of mortality and the reality of hell. And then we all have to contend with the fact that we have to develop a vision for our life that is so compelling that it justifies those bitter realities. And that's really the nature of the religious enterprise. And that's something you can embark on and should embark on young. If you're trying to figure out who you are, it's figure out who you need to be in order to justify the catastrophe of your life. And then you think, well, that was difficult. Man, that's for sure. But it was worth it. So, thank you very much. It was very good of all you to come tonight. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome.
Yep. Lovely to be here.
That's so nice.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yep. Good night.
So let me bring in another chapter that nobody ever asks about, which is chapter 4 on puberty. And I spend a lot of time in that chapter talking about initiation rites, because most societies, traditional societies, have, you know, a girl has to be turned into a woman. Now, girls will, without any socialization, girls will begin to menstruate, they will become fertile. And so societies almost usually mark that point. But for girls, there's a sense that this will happen, and then they have to be inducted into the secrets about sex and parenthood and all those things. Boys, what I learned from my time in cultural psychology, boys is much harder, because boys don't turn into men just by getting older. Little boys are kind of like girls, and they're with their mothers. But especially in a warrior society, you have to get them from the world of girls and women to become a man. How do you do that? Well, a lot of toughening. They need a lot of toughening, and it's a long, drawn-out initiation. And we still see this in fraternities and sororities. Sorority initiations, I believe, are universally more mild at any university than the fraternity. The boys go through much harsher rituals. But where I'm going with this is, how do you turn a boy into a man, or a girl into a woman? How do you turn a child into an adult of their sex? You have to have some guidance from elders, from someone a little older, who is imparting knowledge to them, who is choosing what they consume in the sense of what stories, what inputs. And while we didn't do a great job of that, I mean, when you and I were growing up, a lot of the messages came from television, but at least those messages were made. None of the TV we watched was by other children. None of it was created by other children. It was all created by people in our parents' or our grandparents' generation. And it often had a moral. And it was, for me, it was very American. It was like, this is part of, so television and movies, used to play a huge role in putting in the patterns, the knowledge that you need to be a member of your culture.
And books.
And books, thank you. Yes, of course, and books. So that's why people have cared so much about education, literature, because it's not just the facts you're learning. It's back to our point earlier about the reinforcement learning. You know, if our minds are like an LLM, what are you putting in? Are you putting in movies and books and good television? Or are you putting in little 10-second clips of people getting kicked in the balls? So if you're consuming just millions of little short videos, you're putting garbage in, and your neural network is not going to be very effective. So
not integrated. Not integrated with other people.
That's right.
Yeah.
And no depth. And to bring it back to your point, that the depth of an idea is the degree to which other ideas depend on it. What if you don't have any such ideas? What if all you consumed was little 10-second videos? Nothing is foundational. It's just a whirlwind of dust. There's no foundation.
Yeah, well, that's high entropy. There's no difference between high entropy and anxiety. And there's no union of motivation, so there's no compelling reason to act, to move forward. That's chaos. Yeah. That's the disintegration into chaos.
And that's where a lot of
that's anxiety and demoralization.
A lot of our kids are stuck there.
Okay, let's close this off by the end of your book. You talk about what people can do, and so and you talk about what people can do at different levels of social organization, parents, governments, industry. Now, a huge part of the problem is technological rate of transformation and the race to the bottom, right? And that's something that's almost independent of the actors, unfortunately. It's implicit in the technology. But anyways, and I'd also I think this is what we'll do on the Daily Wire side. I would like to talk to you about what has happened in consequence of your book and what effective steps people have taken. So let's do that. But give people an overview of what you think the institutions, broadly speaking, must and should do about this fragmentation and race to the bottom.
So the key to understanding how this problem got so big so fast and why it's so hard to get out of is the concept of a collective action problem. And so any parent who says, no, sweetheart, I'm not giving you a phone, you're 10 years old, but Mom, all my friends have one, I'm being left out. That's a collective action problem. If it was only half of the kids had it, it would be very easy to resist. But when your child's the only one, same with social media. And so these things, with cigarettes, at the peak of teen smoking in the 90s, it was, I think, 37% of American high school students smoked. You didn't have to smoke because a third of your classmates were smoking. Well, with social media, you do. If half your classmates are on and they're talking about you, you have to be on. Everybody ends up on. So it's a collective action problem. How do you solve collective action problems? Collectively. And so you can have, so what I propose 4 norms that if we can do these 4 norms, we roll back the phone-based childhood. And there's a role for different actors but here are the 4 main norms. The first is no smartphone before high school. Let kids have a flip phone, a basic phone, let them communicate, let them call each other, let them text. But do not let these companies get to them and take up every moment of their day. Now, I don't think this should be a law. In Europe, when I'm there, sometimes they say, we should pass a law banning smartphones for those under 14. As an American, I don't think we should say, you parents, you cannot give your child. So this is a norm. And as long as a bunch of parents start adhering to it, it becomes easier for everyone in the community to do it. So that's the first norm. No smartphone before high school, or 14 if it's not in your country high school. The second norm is no social media till 16. Now this, some of us are doing as a norm. I laid this down for my kids. But it's hard because I'm imposing a cost on my daughter. She says she's the only one who doesn't have Snapchat. That might be an exaggeration, but it feels all her friends have it and they communicate with it. Here is where we really, really need help from legislators. We have minimum ages on things that involve graphic sex, horrific violence, addiction, and physical harm. If your kid's on Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok, they're getting all that. So these are inherently adult activities, talking with adult strangers. We need a minimum age. And Australia has done it. Australia passed a law, it's going to take effect in November, that the minimum age is 16, and the companies have to enforce it. And there are a lot of ways to do that. So many companies do age verification. So that's the second norm. The third norm is phone-free schools. This is just a no-brainer. When you and I were in school, you know, I mean, imagine if we could take our television set into school and watch TV during class and use our walkie-talkies and talk to our friends during class. I mean, it's insane. We never could have done that. But everyone with a smartphone has a lot more than that. They have 50 different things to do during class. So it's crazy that we ever let it get this far. But many states, about 11 or 12 states and a bunch of countries have now gone phone-free. It has to be from the beginning of the day to the end. So that's the main area where the world has changed in the last year, is phone-free schools. And then the fourth norm is far more free play, far more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. Because the book isn't about technology or social media, it's about childhood. And a childhood spent, a phone-based childhood is not a human childhood. Kids are going to miss out on most of the things they need. So we can't just take away the devices and say, okay, you're an only child, sit at home, read books, play guitar. Like, they could do that a little bit, but we have to give them back each other. We have to give them back fun. We have to give them back thrilling adventure, hanging out, riding bicycles, going down and getting in, going down to the 7-Eleven, buying things you shouldn't buy, whatever. So if we do those four things, then we restore childhood in the real world. I believe that rates of anxiety and depression will go down. I believe kids will have more slow dopamine. It won't be all quick dopamine all day long. Test scores, I believe, will stop dropping. This is important. Test scores in the United States actually rose. Academic ability actually rose from the 70s through 2012, and then it began to drop. It dropped more during COVID, but the drop didn't start in 2020. It started in 2012. So our young people are less happy, more anxious and depressed. They know less. Their attention is fragmented. They're lonely, and they feel that their life is pointless. We've got to stop. We've got to stop what we're doing. And the book lays out, those last chapters lay out what role governments can and should play, what role parents can and should play, what role schools can and should play, and to some extent what the tech companies can do. But they have so much money at stake here that I don't expect them. I mean, there are a few like Pinterest that are not harming kids. They've done some things to really protect kids. But the main ones are only going to respond to either legislation or litigation. So I'm hopeful that their behavior will change. But that's what the last part of the book is about. How do we solve this? And I actually think we can solve this in the next few years.
So what we'll do on the Daily Wire side, for those of you who are watching and listening and who are prone to continue the discussion there, is I want to find out more from Dr. Haidt, from Jonathan, from John, what steps have been taken, because I know there has been movements in many states, many provinces in Canada, on the phone-free school front, for example. But I would like to know how widespread that is, who's spearheading it, what's been effective, how this can be moved ahead in the future, the potential pitfalls of intervention of this sort, etc. So you can all join us on the Daily Wire side for that discussion to continue.
Well, this is a strange one. I don't know about you people from Sydney. So, it's from Kathy Newman, which strikes me as somewhat unlikely. And it's got 164 upvotes, which is quite a few upvotes. It hurt when you destroyed me on ABC. Now, I don't know if that's referring to last night or so many months ago, but I've enrolled in university to get my facts right. Yeah, well, that probably won't work. Thank you for enlightening my soul. The burns are still healing. Yeah, well, it's not exactly a question. It's four sentences that are quite the strange combination. I would say something about the burns are still healing. You know, I mean, Nietzsche said that you could tell much about a man's character by how much truth he could tolerate, which is very interesting. You know, there's an idea in the great Western tradition that the truth is the way and the path of life, and that no one comes to the Father except through the truth.
And I believe that to be the case, because I don't think that you can manifest who you are without the truth. And so I think it's literally and metaphorically truth, that the pathway to who you could be if you were completely who you were is through the truth. And I would say, and so the truth does set you free, but the problem is that it destroys everything that isn't worthy in you as it sets you free, and that's a process of burning. And it's painful, because you cling to what you shouldn't be, partly out of pride and partly out of ignorance and partly out of laziness, and so then you encounter something true, and you all know this perfectly well, because when was the last time that you learned something important that wasn't a blow of some sort, you know? And it's often you look back at your life and you think, oh God, I really learned something there. I wouldn't want to do that again, but it really changed my life. I mean, sometimes it can really destroy you, you know, an encounter with the truth, and you never really recover. But now and then something comes along and straightens you out, and a lot of you has to go. A lot of you has to burn away, you know, and I suppose in some sense the idea is that everything about you that isn't worthy is to be put into the flames. And that's another reason to be not so casual about claiming what you believe, because it isn't something that you undertake without due caution. You know, I learned when I was a kid, about 25 or so, a little older than a kid, that almost everything that I said was one form of lie or another. And I wasn't any worse, I would say, than the people that I was associating with, or any better. And the lies were manifold, you know. They were attempts to win arguments for the sake of winning the argument. That might be one. Attempts to indicate my intellectual prowess when there were competitions of that sort. Maybe just the sheer pleasure of engaging in an intellectual argument and winning. My inability to distinguish between ideas that I had read and incorporated because I had read, but hadn't realized that I hadn't yet earned the right to use, all of that. And, you know, I had this experience that lasted a long time. Well, I would say it's really never gone away. And I think this was the awakening of my conscience, essentially. And I didn't realize this until much later, when I was reading Socrates' Apology. This voice, for lack of a better word, made itself manifest inside me, and it said every time I said something that wasn't true, and that's usually what it said. That's not true. You don't believe that. Or there was a sensation that was associated with it. I don't think this is that uncommon, you know. I asked my psychology classes for many years in a row if they had an experience, that they had a voice in their head, let's say, it's a metaphor, or a feeling that communicated to them when they were about to do something wrong. And it was universally the case that people agreed with one of those statements or another. And the other thing I would ask is, well, do you always listen to it? And of course the answer to that was definitely no. But that's also very interesting, you know, that you can have this faculty, this conscience. This seems to me to be very tightly associated with the idea of free will, is that you can have this internal voice, this daemon, the root word for democracy. Oh yes, I didn't finish that story. So yes, well, it's important. Well, so Socrates' daemon told him it was his moral guide. And democracy appears to be predicated on the idea that the polity will function if people attend to their consciences. That's the overlap of those conceptualizations. And well, first of all, I think that's the case, you know, and it makes a certain amount of logical sense. I mean, if we assume that the political state is something like the emergent consequence of the decisions of all its citizens, we would assume that the wiser the decisions of the citizens, the more upright and functional the state.
I can't see how it could be any other way. And perhaps those who are the most upright, who listen to their consciences more carefully, even play a disproportionately powerful role. It's certainly possible. So, anyways, back to truth. Well, you know, I learned that so much of what I was doing was false. And I think I learned this. See, there was a reason that this came to me so clearly.